In my presentation, I would like to focus on the role of exhibition makers in the second half of the 20th century in Czechoslovakia, in particular on the question of when we can begin to speak of them as curators in today's sense of the word. The first generation of curators was taken shape in the West at the end of the 1960s. Was it the same in Czechoslovakia? I will also try to answer the question of when the so-called curatorial turn took place in Czech art. First, let me talk about the situation in the 1960s. In Czechoslovakia, there was a discussion about creating a new type of exhibition conceived by individuals articulating their distinct points of view. This, however, was in contradiction to the then common ideal present throughout the Western discourse, that of so-called objectivity. This notion was based on the traditional Enlightenment idea that a museum's legitimacy was based on rationality and neutrality, where the entire process of preparing an exhibition remained invisible. The idea of the invisible curator was a logical part of this concept. Besides this, there were also local reasons, namely a fear of the dictates of the socialist realist period of the 1950s, when artists were selected for exhibitions according to ideological reasons. The new type of exhibition was thus in direct conflict with the new drive for democracy in the liberalizing 1960s. The emergence of exhibition makers with a distinct profile was greatly aided by the fact that from 1965 onwards, exhibition programs were no longer approved centrally. Instead, an exhibition board headed by a commissioner was appointed for each gallery separately. This made it possible for individual galleries to create their own distinct programs and gave the commissioners a platform through which they could promote their interpretation of art in the long term. I will mention here in more detail two of these commissioners, Jindřich Chalupecký and Ludmila Vachtová, who are, in my opinion, the most important. Jindřich Chalupecký was associated with the Václav Špála Gallery in Prague, which established itself as a prestigious space open to everything progressive and, above all, of high quality. He worked closely with an exhibition committee of like-minded artists and shaped the gallery's circle of artists into a community. In the second half of the 1960s, he also presented the gallery's core group of artists at representative exhibitions of Czechoslovakia, of Czechoslovak art abroad, for instance in West Berlin, The Hague and Rome, an exhibition for London and Paris, which was already being prepared, was not realized for political reasons. When conceiving group exhibitions, Chalupecký selected artists whom he considered relevant, though they were not necessarily linked by a shared artistic viewpoint. He called his method l'accrochage, meaning clash in French, or even directly hanging, which expressed his belief that simply placing works side by side could convey essential information. He usually called exhibitions by the number and type of exhibitors, like 15 printmakers, 13 from Slovakia, 5 sculptors, etc., as Dorothy C. Miller did in the 1940s at MoMA in New York. One generation younger than Chalupecký, Ludmila Vachtová, who headed the gallery on Charles Square, also stuck to the contemporary method based on the selection of so-called quality artists and the idea of the possible objectivity of what was presented, although she refused to cooperate with the exhibition committee and insisted on her autonomy. She concentrated above all on ensuring that the gallery's program communicated a certain viewpoint as a whole, focusing on the confrontation of the two streams of abstraction, lyrical and geometric. In addition, she and Hanna Seifertová also held a unique series of sculpture exhibition in the town of Liberec in North Bohemia, where they confidently presented their selection of Czech, Slovak, Austrian, and Austrian sculpture, contemporary sculpture. They were the first in Czechoslovakia to exhibit sculptures outside the gallery, confronting them with the natural or urban context. In addition to gallery commissioners, contemporary art exhibitions were also put together by occasional curators, who were also active art critics. For the most part, they were advocates of a particular tendency in art. As the first generation of critics in Czechoslovakia, they attached an important function to the medium of the exhibition, since they needed to demonstrate what they were writing about through their exhibition practice. The most notable of these was Jiří Padrta, who, as an art magazine editor, was well aware of current developments in the West, albeit mainly from catalogues and magazines. In 1969, for example, he held the process-oriented exhibition Somewhere Something at the Václav Špála Gallery. It was quite an unusual exhibition within the Czechoslovak context at the time and was held the same year that Harald Zemann's When Attitude Become Form caused a scandal in Bern. Padrta mentioned Zemann's exhibition in the text for his exhibition, but rejected the notion that it should be perceived only as a local variant of a more famous prefigurement. A year earlier, Padrta, as the theoretician of the Crossroads group, had included several guest artists in one of the group's exhibitions, and under the title The New Sensitivity, made it a programmatic exhibition of objective tendencies. The narrow selection of 25 artists was criticized as an aggressive expression of power and unacceptable elitism. This criticism, which came from another exhibition maker who, by comparison, had chosen a democratic method based on a broad selection of artists, was nevertheless an isolated view at the time. Critical discussion of exhibition making in the 1960s was almost non-existent. As can be seen, there were personalities who, through exhibition practice, presented their views on art, which they also elaborated theoretically in texts, and influenced its development. Unlike today's practice, however, they were mostly content with identifying relevant authors and did not engage in more subtle work with meanings. Also missing are the aspects that Terry Smith mentions when trying to define contemporary curating, namely the presence of subjectivity, the discursive aspect, the emphasis on capturing and interpreting what is happening now. Therefore, rather than referring to them as curators, I believe it is more appropriate to refer to them as pre-curators. To label them directly as the first curators would be misleading. The first person with whom we can associate the profession of curator in today's sense is Jiří Valoch, who was not only a theoretician and critic, but also a practicing artist, meaning that he viewed the preparation of exhibitions, the realization of his own work, giving lectures or writing theoretical texts as equal outputs of his creative practice. Valoch systematically promoted new art, like conceptual art, visual poetry, computer graphics, and happenings. He was an active participant in the art scene, and he was constantly traveling and connecting artists and entire scenes. In addition, he collected art and archived accompanying materials. In his case, I could draw parallels with Western curators or art agents, such as Harald Zeman or Seth Siegellaub. A true curatorial turn of the kind described, for example, by Paul O'Neill, did not occur in Czechoslovakia until the 1990s, relatively soon after the ascendancy of the curatorial gesture in the West. It was then the idea of a strong and visible curatorial figure began to take hold in Czechoslovakia, and the exhibition became a new discursive space for artistic practice. The rise of curating after the Velvet Revolution in 1989 was influenced by better access to information and by the possibility of establishing independent platforms, but also by the new ethos of individual freedom that, among other things, was reflected in an emphasis on self-expression. Debate surrounding the strong and active role of the exhibition maker, especially in the sense of manipulation by curators and the kind of power struggles witnessed in connection with the activities of Harald Zeman in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was also a characteristic feature of the birth of curating in Czech art. Some critics feared that the curator could now directly shape and model the art scene, while others even spoke of curatorial terrorism. One case that aroused astonishment was when Vlasta Čiháková-Nošerová, who had returned to the Czech Republic from exile, confidently placed a sign in the gallery stating that she was the author of the exhibition's concept. Czech art lacked the gradual development that the free world had gone through, and the break caused by the curator's seemingly sudden appearance on the scene was thus all the more surprising. But it wasn't artists who criticized these developments, as had been the case in the debate surrounding Documenta 5 in the 1972. This time it was mostly art critics. Thus, while in the 1960s we encountered the first generation of critics who also felt a need to demonstrate their ideas in practice by organizing exhibitions, in the 1990s practical curating began to prevail to a certain extent over critical writing, which most curators were also doing in parallel. Exhibitions became a discursive field, and a curatorial practice was a potential space for critique. The first of several heated debates concerning the role of the curator was sparked in 1991 by the exhibition New Intimacy. Curator Milena Slavická invited artists to try to express the abstract feeling that they got from current events. Just as important as the exhibition was the accompanying catalogue with text by all the participants. The artwork thus consisted not only of the artifact itself, but also of its textual background, which is why New Intimacy could be described as the first discursive exhibition in Czech art. However, the defining role of the curator was still very unusual at the time, and one reviewer of the exhibition warned artists against a game, I quote, a game where everything is at stake, but where the banker, meaning the curator, holds all the cards. In 1990s, this fear of the curator as the most powerful actor, as someone controlling a group of artists, was directed primarily at Jana and Jiří Ševčík. Oh, so this is the catalogue. Jana and Jiří Ševčík, who were the most polarizing figures on the scene and the most visible example of the emerging profession. At the same time, however, Western art had arrived at the idea of a curator characterized by supervisibility. In addition to several other exhibitions during the 1990s, the Ševčíks held a major collective exhibition in Prague every 2 years, in which they attempted to identify the latest developments in Czech art. These exhibitions, which they understood something like institutions, became defining events on the scene. One of them, for example, manifested the social turn in Czech art. If we compare the Ševčík's idea of curating with Terry Smith's contemporary curating, we find many more correlations than in the 1960s. The Ševčíks saw curating as a creative subjective act. The task of the curator, they argued, is to identify expectations, to capture and interpret what is happening now. They also attached importance to the discursive aspect, which in their case included the fact that they were the first in Czech art to talk openly about how and why they were making exhibitions. Although curating today takes many forms, like artists as curators, curatorial collective, etc., in this presentation I have worked with the idea of the curator as it developed in Western art starting in the late 1960s and became fully established in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The curator is seen here as a strong individual, a meta-author whose projects contain both an intellectual and creative component. Why view the art of the socialist and post-socialist states through this lens? The institutional framework in Czechoslovakia was different than in the West. Isn't this just an historical application of non-existent criteria? I believe that it's only by focusing on the aspect of individuality and subjectivity that we can distinguish those people in Czech art in the second half of the 20th century who were not merely organizers, but who conceived exhibitions as a whole through which they tried to express something. And also, this method will enable us to distinguish more clearly between the first curators in the present sense of the word and the pre-curators who paved the way to the establishment of curating. Thank you for your attention.